The first thing Ilara knew was the smell. Wet earth, sharp and ancient, mixed with something else, a cloying, sweetish scent of decay she couldn't quite place. It wasn't the clean, managed dampness of the Broads she'd been surveying moments before, nor the faint, pleasant peatiness of the preserved sections of the ancient sweet-track replica she'd walked just yesterday. This was raw, untamed. A groan escaped her lips, a sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Not the silence of a remote archaeological site, punctuated by distant traffic or the hum of research equipment, but a profound, pressing quiet that felt older than time itself. Her head throbbed, a dull ache behind her eyes. She was lying on something cold and uneven, twigs and damp leaves pricking through her modern synthetic trekking trousers. Slowly, Ilara pushed herself up, her muscles protesting. The world swam into a blurry grey focus. Mist. Thick, pearlescent mist clung to everything, muffling sound and visibility. Shapes resolved themselves into gnarled skeletal trees. Willow, she thought, their branches draped like arthritic fingers. Reeds, taller than she was, formed dense walls around her. Water, dark and still, pooled nearby, reflecting the bruised sky. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her disorientation. Where was Dr. Albright? The survey team? Her GPS unit? She fumbled for the ruggedized tablet clipped to her belt, her fingers clumsy. The screen was dead, black. She pressed the power button, again and again. Nothing. Her satellite phone, usually so reliable even in remote Norfolk, was equally lifeless. "Okay, Ilara, think," she muttered, her voice a ragged whisper in the vast stillness. Storm. There was a storm. Lightning, a weird shimmer over the Nettishall Heath burial mound. She'd been warned by a local that the place was fey, a word she'd dismissed as charming folklore. Now a chill unrelated to the damp air snaked down her spine. Her academic mind, trained in experimental archaeology, in reconstructing the past from fragments, began to race, desperately trying to impose logic on the illogical. This landscape, it was too wild, too untouched. The air itself felt different, heavier, laden with unfamiliar scents, wood smoke, yes, but also something acrid, like poorly tanned hides, and the pervasive marshy smell of the fens, amplified, primal. She stood, her legs unsteady. Her hiking boots, Gore-Tex and Vibram-soled, felt alien on the sucking mud. The scar above her left eyebrow, a thin white line from a childhood climbing accident, throbbed in sympathy with her headache. She was an archaeologist, a student of the early medieval. She knew what this landscape should look like, theoretically. But this felt like stepping not just into a reconstruction, but into the very fabric of the past she studied. Driven by a primal need for shelter and orientation, she began to move, pushing through the reeds, the wet leaves slapping against her face. The mist swirled, playing tricks with distance and direction. Hours seemed to pass. The dull ache in her stomach sharpened into hunger. Thirst clawed at her throat. Then, through a thinning patch of mist, she saw it. A faint plume of smoke, darker than the grey sky. Hope, fragile and desperate, surged through her. Smoke meant people. People meant help, answers. As she drew closer, the outlines of a small settlement emerged from the mist like a half-forgotten dream. Crude huts of wattle and daub, their thatched roofs sagging and dark with damp. No neat fences, no paved paths, just muddy tracks winding between the dwellings. A low palisade, more a deterrent to stray animals than a serious fortification, surrounded the cluster of buildings. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mixture of relief and a profound, unsettling dread. This wasn't a historical reenactment village. There was a crudeness, a lived-in squalor, an authenticity that no museum could replicate. She was on the verge of the village when a dog, lean and wolfish, erupted from behind a hut, barking furiously. Its cry was a signal. Figures began to appear, emerging from doorways, their faces indistinct in the gloom. Men, mostly clad in rough tunics of undyed wool, their expressions wary, hostile. Some carried simple tools, a wood axe, a long-handled billhook that looked unnervingly like weapons. Ilara froze. Her modern outdoor gear, designed for practicality and visibility, suddenly felt garishly out of place. Her short, dark hair, her athletic build, the very way she held herself, confident, analytical, screamed other. One of the men, taller than the rest, with a thick beard and eyes like flint chips, shouted something at her. The language was guttural, alien, yet with a hauntingly familiar cadence. Old English, not the carefully enunciated academic version she'd studied, but a raw dialectal form she could barely grasp. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of non-aggression. "Hello," she tried, her voice trembling slightly. I need help. I'm lost." Her words, modern and clipped, only deepened their suspicion. They advanced, a tight, menacing semicircle. The flint-eyed man barked another command. The dog, emboldened, crept closer, growling low in its throat. This was not a research trip. This was not a misunderstanding. This, Alara realized with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, was something else entirely. Something impossible. She was a stranger in a very, very old land, and they knew she didn't belong. The flint-eyed man gestured sharply with his chin towards the center of the village. There was no room for argument. Surrounded, Alara was herded forward, the mud sucking at her expensive boots, each step taking her further away from everything she knew, into the heart of an England that should have existed only in texts and archaeological digs. She was brought before a slightly larger hut, smoke curling more thickly from a hole in its roof. The reeve, perhaps, or the local Then's representative. The flint-eyed man spoke rapidly to a figure who emerged, older, his face a roadmap of wrinkles but his eyes sharp and assessing. He wore a tunic of slightly better quality, perhaps dyed a faded russet. Alara tried again, speaking slowly, using the simplest words she could think of. Water, food, lost. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture of confusion, of walking aimlessly. The old man listened, his head tilted. He exchanged a few words with the flint-eyed man. Then his gaze fixed on Alara. He spoke. His old English was clearer, more deliberate, but still largely impenetrable. She caught a word, Kuman, come, arrive, and perhaps Fioran, from afar. It was then that a woman's voice, raspy and authoritative, cut through the tension. An older woman, her face weathered like ancient leather, emerged from a nearby hut. She carried a staff, and her eyes, though clouded with age, missed nothing. This was Agnes, the village herbalist and midwife, a woman whose pronouncements carried weight, even if sometimes grudgingly acknowledged. Agnes surveyed Alara from head to toe, her gaze lingering on the strange fabric of Alara's trousers, the sturdy boots, the unfamiliar cut of her jacket. She muttered something to the old man, then to Alara. She pointed to a small, terrified child who had peeked out from behind a hut and, startled by the commotion, had tripped and scraped his knee. The child was now wailing. Instinct, or perhaps a desperate desire to show she wasn't a threat, took over. Alara, before anyone could react, moved quickly towards the boy. She knelt, her voice low and soothing, the tone universal, even if the words were not. She had a small, sealed first aid kit in her jacket pocket. Almost without thinking, she unzipped it. The sound of the zipper, sharp and metallic, made several villagers flinch, and pulled out an antiseptic wipe and a sterile dressing. The villagers watched, mesmerized and suspicious, as she gently cleaned the weeping scrape and applied the dressing with an efficiency none of them had ever witnessed. The child's wails subsided to sniffles, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination at this strange woman and her even stranger magic. Agnes stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She examined Alara's handiwork, then looked hard into Alara's eyes. She spoke again to the old reeve, longer this time. There was a heated exchange. Finally, the reeve grunted, a sound of reluctant concession. Agnes turned back to Alara. She pointed to a dilapidated tiny hut on the very edge of the village, almost swallowed by the encroaching reeds. Then she made a gesture of sleeping, then pointed to Alara. Shelter, of a sort. Alara felt a wave of dizzying relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees. She nodded, trying to convey gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing they wouldn't understand the words, only the intent. She was Alice now, a name she'd plucked from a half-remembered genealogy chart, a survivor of a shipwreck from a land far to the south, her memory of how she came to be in the fens conveniently, and necessarily, clouded. The story was thin, implausible even to her own ears, but it was all she had. The first few weeks were a blur of gnawing hunger, biting cold and profound, crushing loneliness. The hut Agnes had indicated was little more than a crumbling shell, the daub falling away from the wattle in patches, the thatched roof leaking in a dozen places. A pile of damp reeds in one corner served as her bed. The villagers avoided her, their suspicion a palpable force. Children would sometimes throw stones at her hut or call out taunts in their incomprehensible dialect. Her modern gear was a problem. The bright colours, the synthetic fabrics, the zippers and Velcro, they were all wrong. One cold night, shivering uncontrollably, she'd taken her small titanium multi-tool, intending to try and improve the hut's structure. The sight of the gleaming, alien metal in her hand had filled her with a fresh wave of terror. If anyone saw it, she'd buried it deep beneath the floor rushes, along with her dead tablet, her useless phone, and the small, high-powered LED torch. Her compass, a good silver model, she kept, hidden in a makeshift pouch sewn into the lining of her trousers, a secret orientation in a disorienting world. Her sturdy hiking boots, already caked in fen mud, were the last to go. She traded them, through a series of halting gestures and Agnes's reluctant intermediation, for a pair of worn, ill-fitting leather turn shoes and a ragged woolen cloak that smelled of wood smoke, damp earth and something vaguely animal. It was a terrible trade in terms of value, a lifesaver in terms of blending in. Language was her greatest torment and her most urgent task. She listened, endlessly, to the chatter of women at the stream where they washed clothes, to the shouts of men repairing the fish weirs, to the stories Agnes told the children. Old English, in its raw Fenland dialect, was a rushing torrent of sound, but slowly, painstakingly, words began to emerge. Water for water, hlaf for bread, fisk for fish, man for man, quen for woman. She mimicked, she pointed, she endured the laughter and the scorn when her pronunciation was outlandish. Agnes, in her gruff way, was her most consistent, if unintentional, teacher. The old woman would name herbs as she gathered them, her voice raspy: megthe, mayweed, stitcheweert, stitchwort, forthroat, hog's fennel. Elara hoarded these words like precious jewels. Her archaeological knowledge, her carefully curated understanding of early medieval material culture, was both a blessing and a curse. She knew, theoretically, how they should be living, what tools they should possess, what their societal structures might be. But the lived reality was so much harsher, so much more precarious. The constant struggle for food, the ever-present threat of sickness, she boiled all her drinking water, a practice that earned her strange looks, the deeply ingrained superstitions that governed every aspect of life. She'd once tried to explain, through gestures, a more efficient way to dry reeds for thatching, based on airflow principles. The blank, suspicious stares had taught her a valuable lesson. Knowledge out of place was not wisdom, it was witchcraft. From then on, any suggestion she made was couched in terms of a dream she'd had, or something her grandmother in the far-off land used to do. Agnes remained her only tenuous link to the community. The old herbalist allowed Elara to accompany her on foraging trips, not out of kindness, Elara suspected, but because an extra pair of hands, however unskilled, was useful, and perhaps out of a deep-seated curiosity about this strange, out-of-place woman. Elara learned which berries were safe, which fungi meant a swift, agonizing death, how to find edible roots in the marshy ground. She learned the rhythm of the fens, the subtle signs of changing weather, the calls of the marsh birds. Her body, initially soft and accustomed to modern comforts, began to harden. Calluses formed on her hands. The constant hunger became a dull ache she learned to ignore. She grew thinner, her face leaner, the scar above her eyebrow more prominent against her sun-darkened skin. Thomas, the swineherd, a boy of perhaps 10 summers with bright, inquisitive eyes, was another, albeit unofficial, conduit. He was less fearful than the adults, his curiosity outweighing his caution. He'd sometimes leave a small, slightly bruised apple or a handful of hazelnuts near her hut, then watch from a distance as she retrieved them. In return, Elara, when she was sure no one was watching, would show him things. A complex knot she knew from her trekking experience, how to identify the direction of the wind by observing the reeds, a way to make a simple whistle from a hollow stem. These were small, harmless exchanges, but they provided her with snippets of village life, of who was feuding with whom, of whose cow was sick, of when the distant Thans men were expected. One day, a group of men returned from a trading trip to a larger settlement some days' walk away. Among them was a new figure, a man who had not been in the village before. He was Brother Edred, a mendicant friar, his habit well kept despite the rigours of travel, his features sharp and bird-like, his eyes missing nothing. He exuded an aura of pious authority, but there was something in his gaze, a shrewd, appraising quality, that set Elara on edge. Edred's arrival changed the village dynamic. He preached in the small wattle and daub church, his voice resonant, his old English more formal, more educated than the local dialect. He spoke of sin and redemption, of the power of the saints, and of the ever-present dangers of the devil and his minions. He collected alms, his gaze lingering on those who gave generously, and offering sharp rebukes to those who did not. He noticed Alice almost immediately, a woman alone, clearly an outsider, with a strange reticence and an unnerving way of observing things. He made it a point to speak to her, his questions couched in pastoral concern. "From whence do you truly hail, daughter? Your tale of shipwreck is unusual for these parts." Alara stuck to her thin story, her old English still hesitant, her gaze downcast. "My memory, it is like the fen mists, Holy Father. Much is lost." Edred's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. And yet some say you have a certain knowledge of herbs, of small crafts, gifts perhaps from the saints or from other sources." The implied threat was clear. Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This man was dangerous, far more so than the simple superstitious villagers. He was intelligent, manipulative, and he saw her as an anomaly to be investigated and likely exploited or condemned. The Fenland summer, a brief, humid affair of buzzing insects and lush green growth, gave way to autumn. The reeds turned golden, the air grew crisp, and the threat of winter, of starvation, loomed large. Alara had by now established a fragile routine. She helped Agnes with her simples, gathered firewood, mended fishing nets with a surprising dexterity born of her archaeological practice with ancient netting techniques. She was still an outsider, but she was a known outsider, a part of the village's periphery. Brother Edred, however, remained a persistent shadow. He would often chance upon her as she worked, his questions becoming more probing. He heard whispers of how Alice had shown the women a better way to smoke fish, a method that made it last longer through the lean months. He saw how Agnes sometimes deferred to Alara's judgment on the properties of a particular plant. This did not sit well with him. He, Brother Edred, was the conduit of wisdom, divine or otherwise. One day, a child in the village fell gravely ill with a raging fever. The local remedies administered by Agnes seemed to have little effect. Edred seized the opportunity. He prayed loudly over the child, invoking various saints, and declared the illness a test of faith, or perhaps a punishment for some hidden sin within the community. He subtly cast suspicion on Alice, the stranger whose ways were not their ways. "Perhaps," he intoned, his voice carrying through the hushed village, "unfamiliar spirits have been brought among us, troubling the natural order." Alara knew, with a sickening certainty, that the child likely had a severe infection. She also knew that basic hygiene, something entirely lacking in the village, could prevent many such illnesses. She even had a small sealed packet of modern aspirin buried with her other forbidden items, a potentially life-saving anodyne. But to produce it, to explain its use, would be to sign her own death warrant. Agnes, her face etched with worry, worked tirelessly. Alara, watching the old woman's efforts, felt a surge of her modern empathy, a desperate urge to help. She remembered a passage from an old leech book about willow bark, a known source of salicin, the precursor to aspirin. It was a medieval remedy, albeit one often misapplied or misunderstood. Under the cover of near darkness, she spoke to Agnes, her old English now more fluent though still accented. She described the willow bark, how it might be prepared as a decoction. "An old remedy," she said, "from my grandmother's people. Sometimes it helps the fire in the body." Agnes listened, her gaze sharp. She knew of willow bark, of course, but it was not her first resort for fevers. Yet something in Alara's quiet certainty, perhaps her desperation, made the old herbalist pause. With nothing to lose, Agnes prepared the decoction. Miraculously, or perhaps simply due to the antipyretic properties of the salicin, the child's fever began to subside the next day. The village buzzed. Agnes was praised, but whispers also linked the recovery to Alice and her strange foreign knowledge. Edred was furious. His prayers had been overshadowed by a folk remedy, one suggested by the very woman he sought to discredit. His eyes, when they rested on Alara, were cold with a new, more focused malice. He saw her not just as an anomaly, but as a rival. The crisis came during the lean, hungry days of late winter. Food stores were low. The fens were frozen, making fishing and fowling difficult. A sickness, a racking cough and weakness began to spread through the village. Edred proclaimed it a divine scourge, a punishment for the village's wavering faith, for tolerating unnatural influences. His sermons grew more fervent, his insinuations more pointed. He spoke of women who consorted with fen devils, who used unholy charms to heal or harm. Everyone knew whom he meant. One morning, young Thomas, his face pale with fear, came to Alara's hut. "Alice," he whispered, "Brother Edred, he speaks to the reeve. He says you brought the sickness. He says you have the evil eye." Alara's blood ran cold. This was it, the accusation she had dreaded. Later that day, the reeve, his face grim, accompanied by 2 sturdy villagers and a triumphant-looking Brother Edred, came to her hut. "Alice," the reeve said, his voice heavy, "you are accused of maleficium, of bringing ill fortune and sickness upon this village through ungodly means. Brother Edred has laid charges." Edred stepped forward, a small crudely carved wooden bird clutched in his hand. "This," he proclaimed, holding it aloft. "I found this hidden near her dwelling. A poppet, a charm to bind the luck of this village, to call forth the fen spirits." Alara stared at the object. It was one of the simple bird carvings Thomas often made, a toy he'd likely dropped or forgotten. But in Edred's hand, in the charged atmosphere of fear and suspicion, it became damning evidence. She was brought before the assembled villagers in the open space before the small church. It was not a formal trial, but something far more dangerous, a judgment by a terrified, suggestible community guided by a manipulative accuser. Edred laid out his case, a tapestry of twisted observations, half-truths and outright lies. Alara's strange arrival, her unnatural knowledge of herbs, her ability to heal the child when his own prayers had faltered, he conveniently omitted Agnes's role with the willow bark. The poppet, it all painted a picture of a malevolent outsider. Alara knew she could not reveal her true origins. She could not speak of science, of hygiene, of a world beyond their comprehension. She had to fight on their terms, using their beliefs. She looked at the faces in the crowd, fearful, angry, confused. She saw Agnes at the edge, her expression unreadable, her staff planted firmly in the frozen earth. She saw Thomas hiding behind his mother, his eyes wide with terror. When Edred finished, a hush fell. The reeve looked at Alara. "What say you, Alice?" Alara took a deep breath, forcing a calm she did not feel. She spoke, her voice clear, her Old English careful, deliberate. She did not deny her strangeness. "I am a stranger, it is true. My ways are not your ways. The sea cast me here, with little memory of what came before." She looked directly at Edred. "This carving," she said, pointing to the bird, "is it not like those the children of this village make in their play? Is it a thing of evil or a child's forgotten toy, found and twisted to an ill purpose by one who seeks to sow fear?" A murmur went through the crowd. Some looked at their own children. "You say I have knowledge of herbs," Alara continued, her gaze sweeping the villagers. "Does not Mother Agnes also possess such knowledge? Is her wisdom, learned from her own mother and grandmother, also a thing of darkness? She sought to ease the child's fever with willow bark, a remedy known to many. I but reminded her of it." Agnes nodded slowly, a subtle but powerful affirmation. "The willow has ever been a friend to the fevered," she said, her raspy voice cutting through the tension. "No witchcraft there, only the old ways." Edred bristled. "The woman admits her strangeness. She deflects, she twists. What of the sickness that now grips this village? Did it not begin after her influence grew?" "Sickness comes with the winter hunger, holy brother," Alara countered, her voice gaining strength. "It has always been so. Does fear feed the hungry? Do accusations fill empty bellies? Or does it serve one who wishes to be seen as the sole speaker of truth, the sole bringer of comfort, even if that comfort is built on the fear of others?" She then did something unexpected. She looked at Thomas. "Young Thomas," she said gently, "the bird carving. Did you not lose such a thing near my hut some days past, when you were looking for a strayed piglet?" Thomas, terrified but honest, nodded mutely, then whispered, "Ja, Alice, I can this." "Yes, Alice, I lost it." The tide was turning. Doubt flickered in the eyes of the villagers. Edred's face was contorted with fury. He saw his carefully constructed narrative crumbling. "She is a witch, a liar," he shrieked, his composure gone. "She speaks with a serpent's tongue." But his hysteria now worked against him. The villagers who had respected his piety now saw a man losing control, his accusations sounding more like personal vendetta than divine warning. The Reeve, a pragmatic man at heart, stepped forward. "Brother Edred," he said, his tone firm, "your zeal is noted, but the boy speaks true of the carving. Mother Agnes speaks true of the willow. There is much hunger and sickness, yes, but perhaps the blame lies not with one woman, but with the harshness of the season and the will of God, which is not always for us to understand, or to lay at another's door so easily." He looked at Alara. "Alis, you will remain, but walk carefully. This village is wary." Edred, defeated and humiliated, his authority severely undermined, left the village the next day, muttering threats of reporting matters to the bishop. Whether he would or not, Alara didn't know. But the immediate danger had passed. She was not embraced, not truly accepted, but she had survived. She had faced down accusation, not with modern logic, but with an understanding of their world, their fears, their beliefs. She had used their own system against its manipulator. Spring eventually returned to the fens. The ice melted, the birds sang, and new green shoots pushed through the cold earth. Alara, or Alis, as she was now irrevocably known, continued her life. She was a fixture, an oddity, a woman with a strange past and an uncertain future. The scar above her eyebrow was a familiar mark to the villagers now. Her hands were rough, her clothes patched, her Old English fluent, if still accented. She often stood at the edge of the fen as the mist rolled in at dusk, the smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke filling her nostrils. It was the smell of her prison, the smell of her survival. The modern world, with its comforts and its complexities, felt like a fading dream. Alara, the archaeologist, was a ghost. Alis, the fen-dweller, was real. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would likely never leave this time, this place. But as she watched the egrets stalk through the shallows, their forms ghostly in the fading light, there was no longer just fear or despair. There was a quiet resignation, a weary strength, and something akin to a grim, hard-won peace. She had adapted. She had endured. In this ancient, unforgiving corner of England, Alis lived. Next story, the last roses of October clung stubbornly to the thorny stems in the Fowlers' small walled garden, their crimson a defiant splash against the grey stone of the house and the even greyer sky that promised a chill English autumn. 18-year-old Eliza Fowler, bundled in a soft woolen shawl, sat on a low wooden bench, her gaze fixed on one particularly valiant bloom. Her fingers, small and a little clumsy, traced the outline of a fallen petal she had retrieved from the damp earth. A faint, breathy hum, tuneless but contented, vibrated in her chest. Clara Fowler, 4 years Eliza's senior, watched from the scullery window, her hands paused in the mundane task of drying a willow-patterned plate. A familiar ache, a blend of fierce love and a sorrow too deep for easy naming, tightened her own chest. Eliza, her Lissy dear, existed in a world that brushed so gently against the one Clara inhabited, a world perceived through senses that seemed both more acute and more delicately tuned. To most of the inhabitants of Oakhaven, their respectable market town in the gentle folds of southern England, Eliza was simply different and unfortunate, a trial for her family. Clara saw the universe in Eliza's quiet contemplation of a rose. "She'll catch her death, Clara, if you let her sit out there much longer." Mrs. Fowler's voice, perpetually tinged with an anxious quaver, came from the parlour. "The damp seeps into the bones at this time of year." Clara sighed, a small, almost inaudible sound. "She's quite warm, Mama. And the air does her good. She so loves her flowers." She finished drying the plate, her movements precise. Her mother's anxieties, though born of love, often felt like another layer of wrapping around Eliza, smothering rather than protecting. The year was 1868. Whispers from London, carried in newspapers, and the hushed, important tones of men like their own Dr. Armitage, now retired, spoke of new understandings, new classifications for those like Eliza. A Dr. Langdon Down had published a paper, a name that Clara had seen mentioned in a periodical her father occasionally brought home. Mongolism, he'd termed one such type. The word itself felt alien, a crude branding iron on her sister's gentle soul. Eliza looked up, her almond-shaped eyes the colour of warm hazelnuts, finding Clara's at the window. A slow smile, pure and radiant, spread across her face. She lifted the petal, a tiny offering. Clara's heart swelled. How could anyone look at that smile and see only deficiency? "Lissy," Clara called softly, opening the scullery door. "Time to come in, dearest. Cook has a warm scone for you." Eliza's smile widened. Scones were a particular joy. She rose, her movements deliberate, and carefully placed the petal into the pocket of her pinafore before shuffling towards the house, her small, sturdy boots crunching on the gravel path. The locket her mother had given her, a simple silver oval, glinted at her throat. Inside, the scent of baking and coal smoke offered a comforting warmth. Mr. Arthur Fowler sat by the fire in the parlour, the Oakhaven Chronicle spread across his knees. Though Clara suspected he'd read little of it, his thoughts, as they often were, turned inwards, wrestling with concerns he rarely voiced, but which hung in the air like the faint scent of pipe tobacco. He was a solicitor, a man of good standing, and the perceived irregularity of his younger daughter was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of their respectable lives. "Any news, Papa?" Clara asked, guiding Eliza to a small chair near the hearth. Mr. Fowler rustled the paper. "Lord Ashworth's son is to stand for Parliament, it seems. And there's talk of the new railway line extending towards Millingford. Progress, progress." He did not meet her eye. Progress was a word that had begun to carry a certain ominous weight in Clara's mind. What did progress mean for Eliza? The arrival of Dr. Alistair Finch in Oakhaven a month prior had been one such marker of progress. He was young. For a doctor, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a keen, intelligent face and a manner that bespoke London training and an acquaintance with the latest medical theories. He had taken over Dr. Armitage's practice, and his presence had caused a stir of interest and in some quarters a degree of apprehension. Old Dr. Armitage had been a man of poultices and comforting platitudes. Dr. Finch spoke of miasmas and microscopes. It was Mrs. Fowler's recurring nervous headaches that first brought Dr. Finch to their door. Clara had been wary, her protective instincts on high alert. Eliza, sensing the intrusion of a stranger, had remained in her room, a low hum of distress audible even through the closed door. Dr. Finch had been polite, efficient, prescribing a tincture for Mrs. Fowler and offering advice on fresh air and gentle exercise. But his gaze, sharp and appraising, had lingered on the small, carefully arranged collection of shells and coloured stones on a whatnot in the hallway, Eliza's treasures. He had asked, quite casually, about the Fowlers, other child. "Our younger daughter Eliza prefers a quieter life," Mrs. Fowler had said, her voice thin. "Indeed," Dr. Finch had murmured, his eyes thoughtful. Now, a fortnight later, a note had arrived. Dr. Finch requested an interview with Mr. and Mrs. Fowler at their convenience. He wished, he wrote, to discuss a matter of some importance regarding the well-being of their household. A knot of dread tightened in Clara's stomach. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this matter of importance concerned Eliza. The interview was set for the following afternoon. Mr. Fowler paced the parlour, his usual quietude replaced by a restless energy. Mrs. Fowler took to her bed with a lavender-scented cloth pressed to her forehead. Clara found herself hovering near Eliza, her touch more frequent, her voice softer as if to ward off an approaching storm. Eliza, oblivious to the specific cause of the household's unease, but exquisitely sensitive to its currents, was more subdued than usual. She sat for long periods with her doll, Martha, cradled in her arms, her brow furrowed in a miniature imitation of her mother's worry. When Dr. Finch arrived, punctual to the minute, he was shown into the parlour. Mr. Fowler stood stiffly by the mantelpiece. Mrs. Fowler, pale but composed, sat in her usual armchair. Clara had insisted on being present, a request her father had initially resisted, but to which he had eventually warily acquiesced. She sat a little apart, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the doctor. Dr. Finch began with pleasantries, inquiries after Mrs. Fowler's health, a comment on the unseasonable mildness of the weather. Then his tone shifted, becoming more professional, more clinical. "Mr. Fowler, Mrs. Fowler," he began, his gaze moving between them, "I have been giving some thought to your family circumstances, specifically concerning your younger daughter, Miss Eliza." Clara felt her breath catch. "As you know," Dr. Finch continued, his voice smooth and reasonable, "medical science has made significant strides in recent years in understanding the varied presentations of human intellect and development. A colleague of mine in London, a most distinguished physician, Doctor, John Langdon Down, has recently published seminal work on the classification of certain forms of what was previously, and rather crudely, termed idiocy." Mr. Fowler cleared his throat. "Indeed, Doctor. I believe I have seen some mention. Precisely, Dr. Finch nodded. Dr. Down has identified several distinct types, and from my brief observation and from what I understand of Miss Eliza's particularities, I am led to believe she may well fit into the category he has designated as Mongolism. The words, spoken aloud in their quiet parlour, landed like a stone. Clara flinched as if struck. Her mother let out a small, wounded sound. It is characterized, Dr. Finch went on, seemingly oblivious to their distress, by certain physical features, the palpebral fissures, the shortened skull, a certain placidity of temperament. And of course, a notable limitation in intellectual capacity and verbal communication. He paused, as if allowing them to absorb this pronouncement. "What are you saying, Doctor?" Mr. Fowler asked, his voice strained. "I am saying, sir," Dr. Finch replied, his gaze direct, "that there are now solutions, or at least more enlightened approaches to care. Specialized institutions are being established, Mr. Fowler, places where individuals like Miss Eliza can receive appropriate training, within their capacities, of course, and be cared for by staff trained in these matters. It relieves the family of what can be, understandably, a considerable burden, and it allows the patient to exist in an environment more suited to their needs, amongst their own kind, so to speak. A considerable burden. Amongst their own kind. Clara felt a cold fury rise within her, so potent it almost choked her. She saw Eliza in her mind's eye humming to her roses, her face alight with innocent joy. "A burden? An institution?" Mrs. Fowler whispered, her face ashen. "You mean an asylum?" The word was a spectre, conjuring images of bedlam, of barred windows and shadowed corridors. Dr. Finch gave a small deprecating smile. "The term asylum carries unfortunate connotations, madam. These modern establishments are more akin to schools, to homes. They offer structure, safety. Many believe it is the most humane, the most progressive course of action." He turned to Mr. Fowler. "Financially, there are often charitable contributions available for deserving cases, and it would, of course, allow Miss Clara here," he glanced briefly at her, "more freedom to pursue her own life, unencumbered." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floorboards. "Eliza is not a case, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "She is my sister. She is a person, and she is not a burden." Dr. Finch raised an eyebrow, surprised by her vehemence. "My dear Miss Fowler, I understand your sisterly affection, but sentiment, however admirable, must sometimes yield to scientific reality and to practical considerations." "Practical considerations," Clara echoed, her eyes blazing. "Is it practical to tear a child from her home, from the only love and security she has ever known, and confine her among strangers because she does not fit your neat classifications?" Mr. Fowler made a placating gesture. "Clara, please. The doctor is merely offering his professional opinion." But his own face was etched with turmoil. "An opinion that reduces my sister to a set of symptoms," Clara retorted. "An opinion that sees no value in her gentle spirit, her capacity for love, her unique way of seeing the world. She tends her garden, Doctor. She arranges her treasures with a care that would astound you. She knows when I am sad before I speak a word. Is that not of value?" Dr. Finch looked uncomfortable. "These are charming observations, Miss Fowler, but they do not alter the underlying condition. The long-term prognosis for individuals of this type is well established. They require constant care. They will not improve in the way a normal child would." "Improve?" Clara felt a wave of despair. "Improve into what? Someone who no longer hummed to roses? Someone who fit more conveniently into the world's harsh angles?" "I believe," Dr. Finch said, rising, his professional mask firmly in place, "I have given you much to consider. I will leave you to discuss the matter. I would be happy to provide you with literature, perhaps even names of suitable establishments, should you decide to explore this path." He nodded curtly to each of them and, with a final, unreadable glance at Clara, took his leave. The silence he left behind was heavy, suffocating. Mrs. Fowler was weeping softly into her handkerchief. Mr. Fowler stared into the cold hearth, his shoulders slumped. Clara went to the window, her heart hammering. She saw Dr. Finch walk down their neat gravel path, his black bag in hand, a figure of modern science, of inexorable progress. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that a battle had just been declared for Eliza's soul. The days that followed Dr. Finch's visit were thick with unspoken anxieties. Mr. Fowler became more withdrawn, spending long hours in his study, the door closed. Clara would hear the rustle of papers, the occasional heavy sigh. He avoided her gaze, and when he did speak, his tone was clipped, impersonal. Mrs. Fowler drifted through the house like a pale ghost, her headaches more frequent, her reliance on lavender water and darkened rooms increasing. She would often sit by Eliza's side, stroking her hair with a touch that was both tender and fearful, muttering prayers under her breath. Eliza, tuned to the emotional barometer of the household, grew quieter, her usual gentle hums less frequent. She clung more closely to Clara, her small hand often seeking Clara's for reassurance. She would watch her parents with wide, questioning eyes, sensing the discord but not its cause. Her locket, Clara noticed, was rarely unclasped from her small fingers. Clara felt as though she were living in a besieged city. The enemy was not a tangible force, but an insidious idea, cloaked in the language of reason and compassion, yet threatening to annihilate everything that made Eliza's life precious. Dr. Finch's words, burden, amongst their own kind, unencumbered, echoed in her mind, each one a fresh stab of pain. She tried to speak to her father, to reason with him. "Papa," she began one evening, finding him alone in the parlour, staring into the fire, "you cannot seriously be considering what Dr. Finch suggested." He looked up, his face grey with fatigue. "Clara, what am I to do? The man is a doctor. He speaks of science, of new methods. Am I to ignore him? To condemn Eliza to what? A life hidden away? A burden on you when your mother and I are gone?" "She is not a burden," Clara insisted, her voice rising, "and I would never consider her so. How can you even think it?" "It is not what I think entirely," he said, his voice weary. "It is what the world thinks, what the world will offer her, or deny her. These institutions, perhaps they are not the horrors we imagine. Perhaps they do offer a kind of safety, a life free from the judgments she would face. Judgments she would face because people like Dr. Finch teach the world to judge her so," Clara cried. "They create the categories, Papa, and then they offer the solution to the problem they have named." He shook his head. "You are young, Clara. You see things in black and white. Life is more complex." He turned back to the fire, a wall of weary resignation between them. Her conversations with her mother were no more fruitful. Mrs. Fowler would weep, speak of her fears for Eliza's vulnerability, of her own failing strength. "Perhaps it would be for the best, Clara dear," she'd whisper. "A place where she is understood, where they know how to care for such children." "But we understand her, Mama. We know how to care for her." The response was always a fresh bout of tears, a retreat into sorrow. It was during this period that the Reverend Silas Blackwood made his presence felt. He was the vicar of St. Nand, Michael's, a man whose pronouncements carried considerable weight in Oakhaven. Tall and austere, with a gaze that seemed to penetrate to the very marrow of one's spiritual failings, Reverend Blackwood was a pillar of the community, his sermons often dwelling on duty, order, and the Christian obligation to alleviate suffering. Though his interpretation of alleviation often seemed to Clara to mean removing the source of discomfort from public view. He called upon the Fowlers a week after Dr. Finch's visit, his expression one of solemn concern. He was shown into the parlour, and Clara, steeling herself, once again took her place as a silent observer. "My dear Fowlers," he began, his voice sonorous, "I was deeply troubled to hear of the challenges you are facing with young Eliza. Dr. Finch, a man of commendable learning, has shared his professional insights with me." Clara's heart sank. An alliance. "It is a heavy cross you bear," the Reverend continued, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a moment on Clara, with something that might have been pity, or perhaps disapproval of her known protectiveness. "And it is our Christian duty to seek the wisest, most compassionate path for all of God's creatures, especially those most vulnerable." He spoke at length about the sanctity of the family, but then, with a subtle shift, began to discourse on the responsibilities of the community, the wisdom of relying on those with specialized knowledge. He painted a picture of institutions not as places of confinement, but as havens of dedicated care, where individuals like Eliza could be shielded from a world that was, alas, not always kind. "Consider, my friends," he intoned, "the relief it would afford you, the peace of mind knowing she is in capable hands. And for Miss Clara," he turned to her directly, It would free her to embrace the life God intends for a young woman of her standing. Marriage, her own family. These are blessings she should not be denied by circumstance. The implication was clear. Eliza was the circumstance. Clara met his gaze squarely. "Reverend Blackwood," she said, her voice low but steady, "my sister finds her greatest peace and security within these walls with her family. To remove her would be an act of cruelty, not compassion. And as for my own life, I consider it a blessing, not a burden, to be part of hers." A flicker of surprise, perhaps annoyance, crossed the Reverend's face. He was not accustomed to such direct contradiction, especially from a young woman. "Your devotion is admirable, Miss Fowler, but youthful idealism, however pure, can sometimes blind one to harsher realities. There are limits to what even the most devoted family can provide in such cases." "And are there no limits to what can be taken away in the name of providing?" Clara countered, the words escaping before she could check them. Mr. Fowler coughed pointedly. "Clara, that is enough." Reverend Blackwood gave a magnanimous, if somewhat tight, smile. "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, Miss Fowler. We must all be practical. I shall pray for your family, for guidance in this difficult decision." He rose, offered a brief pastoral blessing, and departed, leaving behind an even heavier pall of expectation. Clara felt a profound sense of isolation. The two great pillars of authority in their small world, medicine and religion, had aligned against her, against Eliza. Her parents, caught between love and fear, were wavering. Who else would speak for Eliza if not she? In the days that followed, Clara spent even more time with Eliza, observing her, trying to see the world through her eyes. She noticed the intense way Eliza would watch a ladybird traverse a leaf, her complete absorption in the texture of a velvet ribbon, the way her face would light up at a particular melody Clara hummed. These were not the actions of a vacant mind, but of a mind differently occupied, deeply connected to the sensory world in a way Clara herself could only glimpse. One afternoon, as a wan autumn sun briefly broke through the clouds, Clara took Eliza into the garden. Eliza went straight to her small patch of earth, where a few hardy Michaelmas daisies still bloomed. She touched each flower gently, her lips moving in a silent conversation. Clara sat on the bench, a book unopened in her lap, simply watching. A robin, bold and curious, landed on the low stone wall nearby. Eliza stilled, her eyes fixed on the bird. Slowly, deliberately, she crumbled a tiny piece of scone she had saved in her pocket and held it out on her palm. The robin watched, its head cocked. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with a flick of its wings, the robin hopped closer, snatched the crumb and darted away. Eliza's face was illuminated by a smile of pure, unadulterated delight. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. This was Eliza, this quiet communion, this gentle offering. How could anyone deem such a soul fit only for the sterile confines of an institution? She began to search, in her own small way, for counter-arguments, for different perspectives. Her father's study, though mostly filled with legal tomes, had a few shelves of more general literature. She pored over essays by Ruskin, poetry by Wordsworth, anything that spoke of the value of nature, of the individual spirit, of a world beyond the purely rational and utilitarian. She found little that directly addressed Eliza's situation, but much that nourished her own conviction that there was more to human worth than intellect or conformity. She even dared to write a letter, anonymously, to the editor of a small progressive journal she had once seen, a journal that seemed to champion unconventional ideas. She described, without naming names or locations, a child who was deemed deficient by modern science, but who possessed a unique connection to the natural world and a profound capacity for affection. She asked if there were not other ways to measure a life, other forms of care than institutional confinement. She never received a reply, and doubted the letter was even published, but the act of articulating her thoughts, of sending them out into the void, gave her a small measure of strength. The pressure from outside, however, continued to mount. Mrs. Ainsworth, a prominent local gossip and a pillar of the church sewing circle, made a pointed comment to Mrs. Fowler at the market about the sad trial of caring for an afflicted child at home, and how Providence often guides us to seek help from those with special facilities. The words, relayed by her weeping mother, felt like stones thrown. Dr. Finch, encountering Mr. Fowler in the High Street, renewed his offer of providing names of reputable establishments. He spoke of a new asylum that had opened in Surrey, lauded for its enlightened methods and pleasant grounds. "They say, Fowler," he'd remarked, his tone confidential, "that many of the patients are surprisingly contented there. A routine, simple tasks. It suits their natures." Each such encounter was a fresh assault on Clara's defences. She saw her parents drawing further into a web of anxiety and indecision. Mr. Fowler began to avoid Eliza's presence, his guilt and confusion making it too painful for him to meet her innocent gaze. Mrs. Fowler's care for Eliza became tinged with a frantic, almost desperate quality, as if she were trying to pour a lifetime of love into a few short weeks. A small crisis did indeed occur, just as Clara had feared. One blustery afternoon, the garden gate, its latch loose, blew open while Eliza was playing. Fascinated by a swirl of autumn leaves dancing down the lane, Eliza, for the first time in her life, wandered beyond the familiar confines of their property. It was Clara who found her, not 20 minutes later, standing by the village green, utterly bewildered and distressed by the noise of a passing drayman's cart and the curious stares of a group of children. She was unharmed, but tearful and trembling, clutching her locket so tightly her knuckles were white. Clara brought her home, soothing her with gentle words and warm milk. But the incident, quickly magnified by village talk, reached the ears of Reverend Blackwood. He called again, his expression graver than before. "My dear Fowlers," he said, his voice resonating with sombre authority, "this unfortunate incident only underscores the inherent risks. Young Eliza, in her innocence, cannot be expected to understand the dangers of the world. It is our responsibility, our solemn duty, to ensure her safety. An institution, for all its perceived drawbacks, provides a secure environment, a necessary protection." He spoke directly to Mr. Fowler, man to man, of a father's duty to make difficult choices for the ultimate good of his child and his family. He even quoted scripture, verses about stewardship and providing for one's household, subtly twisting their meaning to support his argument. That evening, Mr. Fowler did not go to his study. He sat in the parlour, a sheaf of papers in his hand, pamphlets, Clara recognised with a sickening lurch, bearing the names of asylums, one of them, the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots, prominently displayed. "Clara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "your mother and I have been discussing this at length. We believe it is time to make inquiries. For Eliza's sake." The room seemed to tilt. Clara stared at her father, at the pamphlets in his hand, and a cold dread, more profound than any she had yet experienced, settled over her. The siege was no longer at the gates, the enemy was within the walls. The decision once voiced seemed to gain an unstoppable momentum. Mr. Fowler wrote letters. Replies came, filled with reassuring prose about humane care, structured environments, and opportunities for simple, useful occupations. Mrs. Fowler began to sort through Eliza's few clothes, her movements slow and mournful, as if preparing for a funeral. Clara felt a rising tide of panic, but also a hardening resolve. She would not let Eliza be swept away on this current of fear and misguided benevolence. She argued, pleaded, reasoned, but her words seemed to break against the wall of her parents' weary conviction that they were, however painfully, doing the right thing. Dr. Finch, when consulted again, was encouraging. "A wise decision, Fowler," he'd said, patting Mr. Fowler's shoulder. "You'll see. In time, you'll all feel the benefit." He spoke of arranging an assessment, a formality, before admission to Earlswood. A date was tentatively set for this assessment, 2 weeks hence. 2 weeks. 14 days to save Eliza from a fate Clara could only imagine with horror. A life among strangers, her individuality submerged, her gentle spirit perhaps broken by the regimentation and impersonality of institutional life. Clara clung to Eliza, her affection more fierce, more desperate. She filled their days with all the things Eliza loved. Long, quiet hours in the garden, now mostly bare, but Eliza still found treasures among the fallen leaves. Stories read aloud in her clearest, most expressive voice, simple songs hummed as they sat by the fire. She tried to imprint these moments of connection, of shared joy, onto her parents' hearts, hoping to reawaken their understanding of who Eliza truly was. Eliza, sensing the profound shift in the household, became increasingly anxious. Her sleep was disturbed. She would wake whimpering, reaching for Clara in the dark. During the day, she rarely let Clara out of her sight, her small hand a constant presence in Clara's own. Her locket became her talisman, her fingers perpetually rubbing its smooth surface. One evening, a few days before the scheduled assessment, Clara was sitting with Eliza by the parlour fire. Their parents were out, a rare visit to cousins in a neighbouring village, a visit Clara suspected was partly to escape the oppressive atmosphere of their own home. Eliza was unusually listless, her head resting against Clara's arm, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Clara began to hum a soft lullaby, one their mother used to sing to them both when they were small. As the familiar melody filled the quiet room, Eliza stirred. She looked up at Clara, her eyes wide and filled with an unnerving clarity. She reached up, her small hand touching Clara's cheek, then her own heart, then gesturing towards the locket at her throat. Her lips moved, and a sound emerged, not a hum, but a word, hesitant, breathy, yet unmistakable. Love? It was more a question than a statement, imbued with a heartbreaking vulnerability. It was one of the few words Eliza ever articulated with such precision. Clara's breath hitched. Tears sprang to her eyes. She pulled Eliza close, burying her face in her sister's soft hair. "Oh, Lissy, yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "So much love. Always." In that moment, Eliza's simple, profound question, her gesture connecting Clara, her own heart, and the locket, a symbol of their mother's love, of family, crystallized everything Clara was fighting for. It was not just about preventing confinement. It was about honoring that love, that connection, that inherent, articulate humanity that shone so clearly from Eliza, if only one knew how to look. The day of the scheduled assessment dawned grey and oppressive. A nervous tension permeated the Fowler household, so thick it felt difficult to breathe. Mrs. Fowler had not slept, her eyes red-rimmed. Mr. Fowler moved about with a forced, brittle composure, his jaw tight. Clara felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach, but beneath it a core of unyielding determination. Dr. Finch was expected at 11. Eliza, dressed in her neatest frock, sat on a small stool by the window, her doll, Martha, clutched tightly. She had been unusually quiet all morning, her gaze repeatedly flitting towards the door, then to Clara's face, her expression one of anxious bewilderment. Clara stayed close, her hand resting on Eliza's shoulder, offering what reassurance she could through touch and soft murmurs. At precisely 11, the sharp rap of the door-knocker echoed through the house. Fowler squared his shoulders and went to open it. Dr. Finch entered, his black bag in hand, his manner briskly professional. He offered a polite greeting, his eyes sweeping the room, taking in the scene, the anxious parents, the defiant older sister, the small, silent child by the window. "Well then," he said, rubbing his hands together as if to ward off a chill, though the parlour was warm from the fire. "Shall we proceed? It is usually best to conduct these assessments in a calm, familiar environment." He approached Eliza, a practiced, reassuring smile on his face. "Good morning, young lady," he said, his voice artificially bright. "And how are we today?" Eliza shrank back, pressing herself against Clara. Her eyes, wide and fearful, were fixed on the doctor, on his unfamiliarity, his intrusive presence. She clutched Martha so tightly her knuckles were white. "She is a little apprehensive, Doctor," Mr. Fowler said, his voice strained. "Quite understandable," Dr. Finch replied smoothly. "It is often the case." He crouched down, attempting to meet Eliza's gaze. "Now, Eliza, can you tell me your name?" Eliza remained silent, her lower lip trembling. She burrowed closer to Clara, her small hand reaching out to grip Clara's skirt. Dr. Finch tried a different tack. He produced a small, brightly coloured wooden block from his bag. "Can you show me what this is, Eliza? Can you point to the colour red?" Eliza stared at the block, then at the doctor, her distress visibly mounting. A low, guttural sound of fear rumbled in her chest. Clara laid a calming hand on Eliza's arm. "She knows her colours, Doctor," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But she is frightened. This is all very strange for her." Of course," Dr. Finch murmured, though a hint of impatience touched his features. He made a few more attempts, asking Eliza to stack some blocks, to identify a picture of an animal. Each attempt was met with the same fearful silence, the same shrinking withdrawal. Eliza's breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking escape. Finally, Dr. Finch straightened up, a sigh escaping his lips. "Well, Mr. Fowler, Mrs. Fowler," he said, turning to them, "it is much as I anticipated. Limited responsiveness, clear developmental delay, an inability to engage in even simple instructive tasks. The typical presentation. Mrs. Fowler let out a small stifled sob. Mr. Fowler's face was a mask of misery. The environment of a specialized institution. Dr. Finch continued, his voice taking on a note of finality, with its structured routines and experienced staff, would undoubtedly be the most beneficial course. They are adept at managing these limitations. It was then that Clara acted. She had not planned it, not consciously. But seeing Eliza's palpable terror, hearing the cold, dismissive pronouncements of the doctor, a surge of desperate, protective love propelled her forward. "No," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. "You are wrong, Doctor. You see nothing of who she truly is." She knelt beside Eliza, taking her sister's trembling hands in her own. "Lissy, dear," she said softly, her gaze holding Eliza's, "show them, my love, show them your heart." She looked towards the mantelpiece, where a small, wilting rose from Eliza's garden stood in a slender vase, a bloom Clara had brought in a few days earlier, knowing how much Eliza loved them. "Lissy," she said gently, is the rose pretty?" Eliza's gaze followed Clara's. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to steady. Her eyes fixed on the fading flower. A flicker of understanding, of recognition, softened her fearful expression. Slowly, hesitantly, she disengaged one hand from Clara's and reached out towards the rose. Her fingers, small and delicate, brushed against a velvety petal. Her lips moved, and then, clear as a tiny bell in the tense silence of the room, she spoke. "Pretty," she whispered. Then, looking directly at Clara, her eyes shining with a sudden, luminous intensity, she added, her voice barely audible but piercingly clear, "Love, Lissy, love Clara." She leaned forward and pressed her cheek against Clara's, a gesture of such profound, unreserved affection that it seemed to fill the room with an almost tangible warmth. A stunned silence fell. Dr. Finch stared, his professional composure momentarily faltering. Mrs. Fowler gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears now streaming freely down her face. Mr. Fowler stood as if rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on his two daughters, on the undeniable, heart-breakingly pure love that flowed between them. The carefully constructed arguments of science, of societal expectation, of practical necessity seemed to crumble before the simple, irrefutable truth of that embrace. He saw not a case, not a burden, but his child, Eliza, expressing a love as deep and real as any he had ever known. He looked at Dr. Finch, and for the first time there was not deference in his eyes, but a dawning, steely resolve. "Doctor," he said, his voice hoarse but firm, I believe we have made a mistake." He crossed the room and knelt beside his daughters, his hand coming to rest on Eliza's small shoulder. "She will stay with us, Doctor," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Eliza will stay home." The relief that washed over Clara was so immense it left her weak. She closed her eyes, holding Eliza tight, tears of her own finally escaping, tears not of sorrow, but of a hard-won, fragile victory. Dr. Finch, after a moment of bewildered silence, collected himself. He cleared his throat, his expression a mixture of professional discomfiture and just perhaps, a grudging, unacknowledged flicker of something else. Surprise, or even a sliver of doubt. "Mr. Fowler," he said, his tone stiff, "if that is your considered decision, then I have no more to say. I must, however, caution you. The responsibilities are significant. The societal perceptions will remain." He picked up his bag. "I wish you well." He offered a curt nod and, without another word, departed. The closing of the front door echoed through the house, not as a sound of finality, but as the sound of a storm passing, leaving in its wake a landscape altered, a path newly, if arduously, chosen. Mrs. Fowler was weeping openly now, but her tears were different, mingled with a profound relief. She came and knelt with her husband and daughters, her arms enfolding them both. "Oh, my darlings," she sobbed. "My brave, brave girls." Eliza, nestled securely in the circle of her family's love, looked from one tear-strewn face to another, a small wondering smile touching her lips. She reached out and patted her mother's cheek, then her father's hand, her touch gentle, comforting. The fear had receded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, luminous understanding. She was home. She was loved. She was safe. The weeks that followed were not without their challenges. Reverend Blackwood, upon hearing of the Fowlers' decision, paid another visit. His disapproval was palpable, though couched in terms of pastoral concern for their misguided sentimentality and the inevitable difficulties they were inviting upon themselves. He spoke of their duty to the community, of the unsettling effect such a deviation from accepted practice might have. But Mr. Fowler, his resolve now firm, stood his ground. "Reverend," he stated calmly, "my daughter Eliza is a child of God, as are we all. Her place is with her family. We will manage." The Reverend departed, his lips pursed, and thereafter the Fowlers found themselves subtly on the periphery of certain church activities, their presence met with a cooler civility by some of the more rigidly conventional members of the congregation. Mrs. Ainsworth's gossip, Clara knew, would continue, perhaps with renewed vigour. But within the walls of their home, a new sense of peace, fragile yet resilient, began to take root. Mr. Fowler, having made his stand, seemed lighter, his interactions with Eliza now filled with a gentle tenderness that had long been overshadowed by anxiety. Mrs. Fowler, freed from the immediate terror of separation, poured her energies into creating a nurturing, predictable environment for Eliza, her earlier fretfulness replaced by a quiet determination. Clara, of course, remained Eliza's anchor. Their bond, forged in love and now tempered by adversity, was stronger than ever. She continued to read to Eliza, to sing with her, to explore the small wonders of their garden. She devised simple games and activities that engaged Eliza's unique way of learning, celebrating each tiny milestone of understanding or communication. There were still difficult days when Eliza was overwhelmed by sensory input or frustrated by her inability to express a complex thought. Days when the weight of societal disapproval, the knowledge of their unconventional path, pressed heavily on Clara. But now they faced these challenges together, a united front. One crisp November afternoon, several weeks after Dr. Finch's final visit, Clara and Eliza were in the garden. The last of the autumn leaves had fallen, carpeting the ground in shades of gold and russet. Eliza, wrapped warmly, was carefully arranging a collection of particularly vibrant leaves on the stone bench, her brow furrowed in concentration, a soft hum emanating from her. Clara watched her, a gentle smile playing on her lips. The future was uncertain, she knew. There would be no miraculous cure, no sudden transformation that would make Eliza normal in the eyes of the world. Their life would continue to be lived on the margins, a quiet defiance of societal expectations. But as she looked at Eliza, at her peaceful absorption, at the innocent joy she found in the simple beauty of a fallen leaf, Clara felt not sorrow, but a profound, unshakable conviction. Eliza's life, in all its unique, gentle complexity, was a gift. Her presence was a blessing. Her love, a beacon. Eliza looked up, her task complete. She held out a perfect crimson maple leaf to Clara, her eyes shining. "Pretty," she said, her voice soft but clear. Clara took the leaf, its delicate veins cool against her palm. "Yes, Lissy dear," she whispered, her heart full. "Very, very pretty." She knew then that their small personal victory was more than just a reprieve. It was an affirmation of a truth more powerful than any medical classification, more enduring than any societal prejudice, that every life, in its own way, has measureless worth, and that love, in its quiet, persistent strength, could indeed move mountains, or at least hold back the tide of a world too quick to judge, too slow to understand. Eliza's whisper of love had been heard, and in their small corner of Oakhaven, England, it had changed everything.